The boardroom was silent except for the soft hum of the city through the tinted glass windows. Edward Langston, sharp in a navy suit, leaned over a stack of documents that gleamed under the overhead lights. His signature pen, a gold Mont Blanc, rested between his fingers. A glass of bourbon sat untouched nearby. The room smelled of leather, polished wood, and something expensive. He stared at the final page, where a blank line awaited his name. Welcome to Heartfelt Stories, where every tale is rooted in emotion, truth, and the kind of twists that stay with you long after the story ends. If you're someone who believes that even the quietest voices can shake the world, you're in the right place. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon because we share powerful stories like this every week. And, trust me, you'll want to watch this one all the way till the end. The last few moments will leave you speechless. Maria wasn't just a cleaner. "This is it," murmured Daniel, his younger brother and CFO. "Once you sign, the restructure begins. The holding company will handle everything offshore." Edward nodded, eyes narrowing. He trusted Daniel, mostly, but lately he'd felt a dull pulse in the back of his mind, like a watch ticking out of rhythm. He brushed it off. Paranoia was part of leadership. Still, something didn't sit right. A faint rustle interrupted the room's stillness. Maria moved quietly along the far wall, mop in hand, wearing a faded uniform and white sneakers. She'd been there since early morning, scrubbing corners no one cared about. Most days, she was invisible. Her presence registered only as background motion, like a chair or clock. But today, as she reached the end of the room, she paused. She didn't look at Edward. She looked at the paper. Her eyes lingered for just a moment too long. Edward noticed. "Need something?" Daniel snapped, more irritated than curious. Maria didn't flinch. Her voice was quiet, steady. "Don't sign this." The room froze. Edward turned fully, studying her face for the first time. There was no fear, no panic, just a strange calm, like someone who had already lost everything and had nothing more to risk. Daniel scoffed. "She's a cleaner. Ignore her." But Edward kept his eyes on her. "Why?" Maria hesitated. She looked down, then simply said, "Because I've seen papers like that before. They're never what they seem." Daniel laughed awkwardly. "Edward, come on." But the words clung to Edward's skin. Maria didn't explain further. She picked up her mop bucket and quietly exited the room, disappearing into the hallway. A silence followed. Edward looked back at the document. "I want to review this again," he said finally, closing the folder and setting his pen down. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You serious?" "Just a day," Edward said. "It can wait one day." Daniel didn't argue, but the way he stood too still, shoulders slightly raised, didn't go unnoticed. Later that evening, Edward sat alone in his office. The document was still sealed in its folder, untouched. He couldn't shake Maria's voice. Not her words, those were simple, but the way she said them. He opened his laptop and searched the name of the offshore firm listed in the paperwork. What he found made his stomach turn. Shell companies, asset redirects, multiple aliases connected to the address. He leaned back in his chair, heart pounding. And she may have just saved his life. But who was she? And how did she know? He stared at the mop streak still faintly visible on the marble floor. In that moment, Edward Langston knew one thing. He would never see Maria the same way again. Edward Langston stood alone in the boardroom after everyone had gone. The lights buzzed faintly overhead. The papers still lay on the table right where he had left them, his untouched signature line like a blinking cursor on a screen. Maria's. Words echoed in his mind like an aftershock. "Don't sign this." It wasn't the words themselves. It was the conviction behind them. Calm. Sure. Not pleading. Not warning. Just knowing. He picked up the file again and flipped through the pages. Everything looked in order. Legal jargon, profit models, standard, clauses. But now every word looked like a potential trap. He pressed the intercom. "Caitlin, can you come in here?" Moments later, his assistant entered, clipboard in hand, heels clicking against the floor. "I need something," Edward said, not looking up. "The original versions of this agreement. The one legal drafted last month, before the updates Daniel brought in." Caitlin blinked. "You want the pre-merger copy?" "Yes," he replied. "And pull any tracked changes. I want to see the document history." She nodded slowly and left. Edward sat down, breathing through the tension. He had built this company from the ground up. He had trusted Daniel with everything. But now, he wasn't sure. Half an hour later, Caitlin returned with 2 sets of files and placed them side by side. Edward opened them slowly, methodically. His eyes scanned the signatures at the bottom. Something was off. The signature next to the legal. Advisor's name didn't match the one on the previous version. Subtle differences. A tighter curve, a sharper line. To a casual observer, identical. To Edward, a red flag. He flipped back to the clause about international holding. It hadn't been there before. "Who uploaded these changes?" he asked. Caitlin hesitated. "Daniel said it was approved in a private meeting. I assumed legal signed off." Edward's hands froze on the page. He looked up. "Get it to pull the edit logs from the legal server. I want to know who accessed this file in the past 2 weeks." Caitlin nodded, sensing something had shifted. When she left, Edward stood again and walked toward the window. Rain began to patter against the glass. Soft, steady, familiar. Just like the day he saw her. Maria. The cleaner who knew too much. Who whispered a warning that saved him from signing away control of everything he built. But how? Who was she watching? Was it Daniel, or was it him? He turned back toward the file on the table, its pages now heavy with suspicion. He no longer saw a business deal. He saw a setup, and someone, maybe more than one, wanted him blind. But Maria. Maria had seen it coming. Maria sat across from Edward in a small conference room, far from the glass-walled boardroom and its million-dollar views. Here the lights were dimmer, the silence more honest. Edward folded his hands and studied the woman who had once just been the cleaner, invisible, efficient, forgettable. But now she had become the only person he didn't understand. "I didn't mean to scare you," Maria said softly, her voice almost apologetic. "You didn't scare me," Edward replied. "You stopped me." She smiled faintly. "That's not easy to do, I imagine." A silence stretched between them before he leaned forward. "Who are you, Maria?" Her eyes didn't flinch. Instead, she looked past him, toward the corner of the room, as if seeing something that wasn't there. "I used to work at a law firm," she said. "Before this. Before everything." Edward raised an eyebrow. "What kind of work?" "Contract review. Compliance, mostly," she replied. "I had a gift for spotting fine print no one else noticed." "And you left that life to mop floors?" "No," she said slowly. "That life left me." He didn't speak. Maria continued, voice tighter now. "My husband was in corporate security. 5 years ago, he found out something about a CEO, money laundering, maybe worse. He filed a report, followed the whistleblower protocols. 2 weeks later, he went missing. Police found nothing. The company buried it." Edward leaned back slightly. "What was the company's name?" Maria looked directly at him now. "Ever heard of Pirelink Holdings?" Edward stiffened. That name hadn't come up in years, but he remembered. Pirelink had been a partner in one of his earliest ventures. Their CEO had been accused of fraud before the charges quietly vanished. Maria nodded, reading his face. Exactly. I cleaned that building too. He swallowed. The air in the room shifted. You think something like that is happening here? He asked. I think someone in your circle, she replied carefully, is rewriting deals in ways that benefit someone else and putting your name on it. He studied her, eyes narrowing. And you're just telling me this? Why? Maria paused, then said something that unnerved him more than any accusation. Because if I don't, no one will. Edward didn't know what to believe. But one thing was clear. This woman wasn't just a cleaner. She was watching, listening, connecting dots others never saw. She stood up slowly. You asked who I am, she said. I'm the kind of person no one questions, until it's too late. She walked toward the door, pausing just before leaving. Someone in your company is trying to erase you, Mr. Langston. You just haven't looked in the right mirror yet. As the door clicked shut behind her, Edward sat motionless, feeling for the first time in a long while like he wasn't in control. And outside, in the hallway, Maria disappeared back into the silence. Edward had always believed blood meant loyalty. That family, despite all its scars and silences, would never cross certain lines. But as he stared at the financial statements spread across his mahogany desk, those illusions collapsed line by line. Why would Daniel authorize a transfer from a dormant account? He muttered aloud. Maria, standing silently at the edge of the room, didn't answer right away. Instead, she handed him a second file, one she had retrieved from the archives no assistant ever checked. Inside, emails, transfer requests, signed forms, all bearing Daniel's digital signature. 3 companies, she said softly. All shell corporations, all owned by the same trust in the Caymans. Guess who set up the trust? Edward didn't answer. He already knew. His jaw tightened. He's your little brother, Maria added gently. But he's not the brother you remember. Edward turned sharply to face her. You've been watching him? I watch everything, she replied. It's how I survived. He looked down at a faded photo on his desk. Him and Daniel, arms around each other at their first company launch. A day that had felt like triumph, like unity. Now that same brother had orchestrated the shady deal Maria warned him about. And worse, Edward realized, Daniel hadn't even tried to hide it well, as if he believed Edward would never look. That betrayal cut deeper than any forged signature. I need to hear it from him, Edward said suddenly, standing up. Maria didn't stop him, but before he left, she whispered, Just be careful. Some people lie with such confidence they make you doubt your own truth. Edward found Daniel alone in the executive lounge, sipping scotch like it was any other Thursday. The skyline burned behind him in the evening light. You authorized the Elridge deal, Edward said without ceremony. Daniel turned. No guilt, no panic. Just a slow, annoyed blink. I closed it, yes. You were too busy second-guessing everything. There were duplicate contracts, shell accounts, private payouts. Daniel stood now. You're seriously taking the word of the janitor over your own brother? Edward flinched, not because of the insult to Maria, but because of the calmness in Daniel's voice. That janitor saw what I didn't, he said coldly. Daniel smiled thinly. You always needed someone else to spot the fire before. You smelled the smoke. Edward felt something shift, something that had always been fragile between them finally snapping. He walked away without another word. Back in his office, he sat in silence. Maria reappeared in the doorway. Well? Edward looked up, eyes hollow. You were right. She stepped inside and placed one more file on his desk, thicker than the rest. Then you're ready for what's next. Edward didn't ask what it was. He opened the file, and his hands began to shake. The surveillance room sat hidden behind a false bookshelf in Edward's private study. Only two people had access, Edward and Daniel. Now Edward sat alone under the dim glow of the monitor wall, rewinding security footage from the past 30 days. The screens flickered with familiar hallways, empty offices, cleaning staff, assistants, all routine, until one feed paused him. It was Maria, midnight, alone in the archives. She wasn't stealing. She wasn't even touching anything at first. Just standing in front of the file cabinets, head tilted slightly, as if listening to the silence. Then, slowly, she opened drawers, pulled documents, placed them back precisely. No panic, no rush. Like she'd done it 100 times before. Edward leaned forward. This wasn't luck. It was method. It was survival. A new window opened. Another feed. Daniel 2 on 13 a.m. He entered through the side garden entrance, one that bypassed the main alarms. Edward hadn't even remembered that route still existed. Daniel moved like he'd memorized every blind spot. He met a man in a dark suit in the East Lounge. No introductions, no hesitation. Just documents exchanged, briefcases placed beside each other. Edward hit pause and enlarged the frame. The lawyer's face was blurred, but the logo on his notepad wasn't. Bellman and Rowe LLP, an aggressive corporate firm, one that handled hostile takeovers. Edward exhaled sharply. It all made sense now. The urgency, the rushed documents, the pressuring tone Daniel used. Maria hadn't stumbled into the truth. She'd survived long enough in shadows to see what light missed. He reviewed the footage of her again, frame by frame. Her eyes never wandered. She was scanning, decoding. "Why didn't you just tell me everything?" Edward whispered to the screen. As if answering, another recording played automatically. This one showed Maria standing in the empty boardroom, placing a sticky note on Edward's chair. The camera caught a close glimpse before she walked out. People only see what they're ready to accept. Edward stared at the note, heart sinking. How many other warnings had he missed? Suddenly, a knock echoed from the hallway. Maria entered, calm as ever. "You saw it?" she said. Edward nodded. "You still think I overstepped?" "No," he said quietly. "I think I underestimated you." Maria looked at the wall of screens. "Daniel won't stop. He thinks you're weak, that you'll forgive anything if it's called family." Edward's silence confirmed her fear. "Need to know," she said. "Are you ready to stop protecting people who would bury you to save themselves?" Edward looked again at the footage, at the brother who once held his hand on stage, at the woman no one noticed, except the cameras. "Yes," he said. "I'm ready." Maria didn't smile. She simply turned and walked out, because she already knew. Edward waited until the mansion was quiet. No assistants, no advisors, no surveillance. He found Maria where she always was when no one was watching, the small staff break room, alone with a cup of tea, staring into nothing. He stepped inside, quietly closing the door behind him. She didn't look up. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you helping me?" Maria placed the cup down, her fingers lingering on the rim. Then slowly she lifted her gaze. No smile, no fear. "Because someone once helped me," she whispered, "when I had nothing." The silence after her words felt heavier than any accusation Edward had faced in boardrooms. He pulled out a chair across from her. "That's not an answer. That's a memory." She nodded. "And memories guide people more than logic ever does." Edward studied her. There were lines under her eyes, etched by loss, not age. A sadness she didn't wear for pity. A strength that didn't need recognition. "I've had deals go bad before," he said quietly. "People steal. They lie. They sell me out. But none of them ever warned me." Maria looked down. That's because they had something to gain. And you don't? She met his gaze again. What could I possibly gain? I mop your floors. I eat in the corner. I enter through the back. Edward flinched at her clarity. Maria leaned forward, voice softer now. My husband was a journalist, whistleblower. He uncovered a child trafficking ring in a charity organization, one that had powerful donors. The night he submitted his final draft, he disappeared. Edward's breath caught. Did you ever find out who? No, she cut in. But I learned. I learned that truth doesn't protect the weak. Silence does. She stood slowly. Until now, I've stayed quiet. But when I saw that document, when I saw your brother's name, I remembered the name from one of my husband's old files. Edward stood too. Daniel? Maria didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, I don't trust easily, but I saw something in you. You hesitated before signing. That hesitation means you still listen to your gut. He walked to the window, the city skyline stretching far beyond the glass. You could have walked away, he said. Stayed quiet. I almost did, she admitted. But then I saw the cleaners being laid off, departments shutting down, your company's name tied to something darker. I knew if you signed that deal, it wouldn't just end your legacy, it would bury your conscience. Edward turned slowly. I need to know more, Maria. About you, about Daniel, about everything. She picked up her cup. Then stop asking the wrong people for the truth. What do you mean? Your advisors, your lawyers, your brother. They all have something to lose if you open the wrong drawer. Edward's jaw tightened. Maria walked toward the door, paused, and added, I still have a copy of one of my husband's reports. I never read it, because I was afraid of what I'd find. But maybe it's time. She left. And Edward, alone in a room, he owned but no longer understood, realized something terrifying. She had nothing to gain, which meant she had no reason to lie. The next morning, Edward entered his private study, only to find Maria already seated there, a dusty file open before her, its pages spread out like a quiet accusation. She looked up, unshaken. I didn't break in. Your assistant gave me the key. Edward didn't respond. He only walked forward slowly, eyes narrowing on the documents in front of her. These were hidden in the filing cabinet behind the false panel, she said. Your assistant never even knew it existed, but your wife did. Her initials are carved under the desk. Maria slid a page forward. Edward froze. It was a property transfer agreement, signed by him, or rather, a flawless imitation of his signature. His blood ran cold. This is a transfer of the mansion, he whispered, to a dummy corporation in the Caymans. Langston Holdings isn't just the name of your company anymore, Maria added, voice quiet but cutting. It's being restructured, absorbed, piece by piece. Edward scanned the names listed, lawyers he knew, bankers he'd once trusted. Even the notary was a familiar contact, someone from his brother Daniel's wedding. He sank into the chair across from her. I had no idea. I never signed any of this. That's the point, Maria replied. You weren't supposed to. She placed another sheet forward. But you signed this, she said, 2 years ago. A document granting Daniel limited power of attorney for overseas transactions. He used it to build a legal path. Edward closed his eyes. So he laid the foundation years ago. Maria nodded. Brick by brick. He stared at the ceiling for a long moment before muttering, It was never about the deal. Not really. No, she said softly. It was about the legacy, the name, the empire, and this house. Edward glanced around the room, the portraits, the glass cabinets, the silent piano by the window. He wanted the mansion. He wanted to become you, she corrected. And now, He almost did. Edward stood abruptly, pacing. The accounts, the trusts. If he has control of the offshore firm, he could liquidate everything, Maria finished. Without blinking, he turned to her, fury clashing with disbelief. How do you know all this? She held his gaze. Because this isn't the first time I've seen a man lose his life while thinking he was still in charge of it. A long silence fell between them. Edward finally whispered, "This house was supposed to be mine." Maria's response was immediate and sharp. Ownership is more than a name on paper. It's who protects it, who understands what it holds. He looked at her, and in that moment he saw it clearly. Maria didn't live in the mansion, but she knew it. Its shadows, its secrets, its silent alarms. And maybe that's why she noticed what he didn't. He stepped closer. "We take this to the police." She shook her head. "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because Daniel doesn't know we know," she said. "And that's the only advantage we have left." Edward's fists clenched. "So what do we do?" Maria slowly stood, gathering the documents. "We let him finish the betrayal, and then..." She looked at him, dead in the eyes. "We own the ending." The storm had gathered all day, but it wasn't until the clock struck midnight that thunder cracked over the mansion. Inside the grand library, Edward waited, papers trembling in his hands. Daniel arrived late, smirking, loose tie, whiskey on, his breath. "You found the files," he said without pretense. Edward didn't sit. He didn't offer a drink. "You forged my name. You rerouted accounts. You tried to erase me." Daniel laughed. "Erase you? Brother, I'm rescuing the legacy. You just couldn't see the rot." Edward slammed the documents onto the mahogany table. "This house is not yours." "No," Daniel said, stepping closer. "But it soon will be." The tension shattered. A shove, then fists, then glass. Books toppled. A chair crashed against the wall. Edward swung, missed. Daniel struck back, harder, fueled by years of resentment. Then something sharp glinted. A paper knife, a ceremonial blade from the shelf. Slicing pain tore across Edward's shoulder. He fell back, hand pressed to the blood soaking through his shirt. Daniel froze, breathing heavily. "You weren't supposed to push." Footsteps thundered in from the hall. Maria! She saw the blood before anything else. "No police," Edward gasped, still on the floor. "Not yet." Daniel was already gone. Maria knelt beside Edward, ripped the silk curtain from the window, and pressed it against the wound. Her hands were steady. Her voice was not. "This is spiraling." "I underestimated him," Edward muttered. Maria reached into her coat and pulled out a phone. Not her usual one. A black burner. She dialed a number she hadn't touched in a decade. "It's me," she said into the line. "I'm cashing in the favor." A pause. Then she added, "Yes, I know you're disbarred. That's why I'm calling you." She ended the call and turned to Edward. "He'll meet us at the service elevator in 20 minutes. He'll stitch you up, and then he'll tell us how to burn your brother without starting a war." Edward groaned. "You always have a backup plan?" Maria's eyes flickered with something between grief and rage. "Not always. That's why I lost everything once. I don't lose twice." The room was quiet again, except for the pounding rain. Edward slumped against the wall, still clutching his shoulder. Maria wiped the blade clean and placed it back on, the table where it had once belonged. "Tonight," she said, "wasn't about contracts." Edward looked up. "Then what was it?" "Blood," she answered coldly. "And the price of letting it rule." The thunder echoed outside. Somewhere. Upstairs, the wind rattled a window loose, and Maria didn't look up. The courtroom was smaller than Edward expected. No oak-paneled drama, no towering ceilings, just dull white walls, the hum of fluorescent lights, and rows of cheap wooden benches. But power doesn't need a stage, it needs proof. And Maria had provided that, quietly, precisely, and without asking for anything in return. Edward sat at the plaintiff's table, his shoulders still stiff beneath his tailored suit. Daniel, on the other side, looked cocky at first, his lawyer whispering reassurances, flipping through documents with smug certainty. But Daniel hadn't seen the new pages. Not yet. At the back of the room, Maria sat in silence, head lowered, plain cardigan buttoned to her throat. She looked like a cleaner on break, not the woman who had turned the tides of $1 million betrayal. No one gave her a second glance. That was the point. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Then it began. Legal language danced through the air, terms like executory contract, prima facie fraud, and document manipulation with intent to deceive. Daniel's smirk began to fade as the judge picked up the final packet. "This court has reviewed the authenticated signature records," the judge said, voice calm but cutting. "It has been verified through forensic handwriting analysis and metadata recovery that the property transfer agreement was forged." Daniel sat up straighter. "That's absurd." "Sit down," his lawyer hissed. The judge continued. "The court therefore nullifies the contract in question. All assets are to be returned to Edward Langston effective immediately." Silence fell like a curtain. Daniel turned toward Edward, eyes wide. You had help." Edward didn't respond. He didn't need to. The judge's gavel fell once, crisp and final. Bang. Daniel's future collapsed with the sound. At the back, Maria stood quietly. No one noticed. No one asked her name. She moved like a shadow between shadows, her presence, never rising above a whisper, but her work had spoken louder than any scream. As she slipped out of the courtroom, the wind tugged gently at her sleeves. She paused for just a moment on the courthouse steps, gazing out at the city street. Unremarkable, ordinary, full of people who had no idea what had just happened inside. No cameras waited. No applause followed. Just the quiet click of her shoes as she walked away. Inside, Edward remained seated for a long time. Papers were being packed. Lawyers were murmuring. Daniel was shouting at someone about an appeal. But Edward only stared at the door Maria had walked through. He finally understood. Justice wasn't always loud. It wasn't always delivered in courtrooms or headlines. Sometimes it came in the form of a whispered warning. Sometimes it looked like a woman pushing a mop, holding the truth like a blade no one saw coming. And as the courtroom emptied, Edward rose, buttoned his jacket, and left through the same door, not to chase Maria, but to follow the truth, wherever she had gone. The mansion was quiet again. No court dates, no legal documents, no late-night whispers echoing down sterile marble halls. Edward stood alone in his study, holding the check he'd written for Maria, an amount that would erase any hardship, pay for any dream. The ink was barely dry, yet it already felt worthless. She had left hours ago. No goodbye. No trace. Just a whisper of a woman and the silence she left behind. He had found a folded envelope on his desk drawer this morning, tucked, neatly beneath an old family photo. At first, he thought it was another document, maybe something legal, something tied to her past. But when he opened it, his hands stilled. It was a yellowing newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Whistleblower lawyer found dead after exposing. Corrupt pharmaceutical deal." The man's name jumped out like a ghost. Gabriel Alvarez. Edward blinked. That was Maria's last name. And the photo in the corner? A younger man, eyes sharp, smile soft. Her husband. The article was brief but brutal. Gabriel had uncovered a web of fraud and malpractice in a major hospital chain. Days after he went public, his car was found wrecked off a mountain road. Officials ruled it an accident. But the article noted something chilling. Investigators found the brake lines had been tampered with, but no suspects were ever identified. Edward sat down slowly, heart heavy with a weight he hadn't earned, but now carried. Maria hadn't just been warning him. She had been fighting for something she'd already lost. She had seen the same signs, the same greed, the same shadows that took her husband. She had watched history threaten to repeat itself and chose to stop it, even if it meant exposing herself. Her war hadn't ended in a courtroom. It had ended in a mop closet, in a whisper, in a quiet refusal to look away. He took the check and slipped it into his desk. It didn't feel like gratitude anymore. It felt like insult. Maria hadn't wanted money. She wanted to be heard, but her voice had never needed volume, just courage. Edward stood and looked out the tall glass window that framed the city. Somewhere out there, Maria was beginning a new chapter, probably sweeping another floor, watching another powerful man teeter on the edge of corruption, or maybe, just maybe, she was finally resting. He didn't know. But he did know this. Her silence had been louder than all his wealth. The truth she gave him wasn't free. It came at the cost of her past, her safety, and maybe the last pieces of peace she still clung. Sadhi turned from the window, opened a drawer, and gently placed the article beside a new framed photo. This one of his mansion, intact, reclaimed, not because of lawyers, because of her, because of Maria, and beneath the frame in small script, he added her name, not as a cleaner, but as the one who saved everything. The months passed, but Edward Langston never heard her voice again. Maria was gone. No forwarding address, no formal farewell, just absence. At first, he assumed she had returned home, wherever that was. Then a former colleague quietly mentioned seeing her name on a small-town petition. Something about land rights. A corrupt developer trying to seize farmland. She wasn't leading the protest, of course, just organizing from the shadows, signatures collected, stories gathered. A quiet resistance. It was always how she fought. Gently, persistently, without applause. Edward stood in his office, hands behind his back, staring at the framed document mounted on the wall. The very contract that nearly stripped him of everything. It remained unsigned, its blank line a louder message than any ink could have written. Below it, engraved in brushed brass, were 4 simple words. Don't sign this. Maria. That whisper had saved his life, and changed it. Visitors often paused at the display, confused. Some asked why he framed a fraudulent document. Others asked about the quote. Edward never offered explanations. If they needed one, they didn't deserve to know. It wasn't about the paper. It was about what it represented, what she represented. There were days he wondered if Maria had ever truly existed, if she was some imagined figure his conscience conjured to pull him from the edge. But then he'd remember her eyes, the weight behind them, the steady calm of someone who had lost everything and still chose to protect others. He remembered the pain she carried in silence, the way she stood smaller in a room, not because she was weak, but because the world never gave her space. He remembered how she warned him not out of benefit, but memory. Her life had taught her what betrayal looked like. She had once watched someone sign the wrong paper. She wasn't going to let it happen again, even if it meant vanishing, even if it meant no thanks, no reward, no place in his mansion. She had chosen truth over safety. And now her story lived in a frame on his wall, and in every decision he made after. The new employees in the company knew the story in fragments. The cleaner who stopped a billionaire scam, they whispered. They called her a ghost. Guardian, a myth. But to Edward, she was none of those things. She was real, and her last words still echoed every morning when he entered the office. Don't sign this. Not just papers, not just lies, not just betrayals disguised in ink. He looked away from the frame and picked up a new proposal from his desk. He read every word, slowly, carefully, no shortcuts, no trust without truth. Because once, someone believed enough in him to whisper a warning when no one else dared. And that whisper became the loudest thing in his world. Forever. Edward Langston no longer signed papers the way he used to. Every stroke of the pen now carried memory, weight, and caution. Not just about business, but about people. Trust, integrity, names that never made headlines, like Maria. She was gone, but her impact clung to the hallways of his mansion like the scent of old pine and lemon polish. Silent, but present. Everywhere. Weeks after her disappearance, Edward called for a full audit, not of finances, but of people. Salaries, hiring, policies, background checks, promotions. He noticed a pattern. The unseen always bore the heaviest loads. Cleaning staff, kitchen workers, office janitors, single mothers and aging women working night shifts while raising families or fleeing broken ones. They all reminded him of her, so he made changes, big ones. He fired 3 board members caught exploiting low-level staff. He dissolved a silent outsourcing contract to a shell company Daniel had set up, redirecting the funds to build an in-house support system for underrepresented employees. And he created a new hiring directive. Give chances to people with stories, not just resumes, to those who had fallen through systems. Those with silent eyes and whispered truths. The media called it a rebrand, but for Edward, it was a reckoning. One quiet afternoon, months later, the mansion welcomed a new cleaner. Her name was Priya. Young, nervous, clutching her mop like a shield. She'd come through a shelter's referral program, an initiative Edward funded in Maria's honor. She entered the grand foyer, hesitant, adjusting her name tag. The mansion still looked intimidating, even after all the changes. A place of glass and marble and history. A place where the powerful still paced the halls. Edward was coming down the staircase as she entered. Their eyes met. She froze. He smiled gently. First day? She nodded. Good, he said, then paused, walking down the last few steps until they stood nearly eye to eye. He lowered his voice, just enough that only she could hear. Ask questions, he said, even if no one listens. She blinked, unsure what he meant. But he meant every word. Behind him, in a shadowed hallway, hung the infamous framed contract, the one he never signed. Below it, Maria's words, "Don't sign this." They had built an empire from silence. Now Edward was trying to build something different from it, something honest, even if it was slow. Priya slowly nodded. She didn't understand everything yet, but she would. That night, Edward stood alone in the empty office, looking out at the moonlit lawn. Somewhere out there, Maria lived her life quietly, fighting for others perhaps, healing maybe, forgotten by the world, but unforgettable to him. He picked up a pen, signed a new employee benefits policy into law, then placed the pen down beside. The framed contract, some things were signed with ink, but the most important ones were signed by the heart. And in that silent mansion, where one cleaner had once whispered the truth, a new chapter had begun. Quiet, steady, rewritten.